here for over 2 decades.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I thanked Rebecca for for spilling how old I am, I guess.
You actually look very young.
Well, I started young, so bonus.
Right now, you are the executive director, but I'm assuming when you started, you were curator.
I had come to Prince George for university. So I was just 17 when I arrived, and I started volunteering with Huble Homestead. Actually, they were looking for curatorial volunteers, and so I would go in every Wednesday. I didn't have classes, and I would enter artifact records into the database because they were all on paper at that time. This was around 2003. So I volunteered for a couple years, and then I got a part-time job actually in 2005. I became the curatorial and operations assistant. So I was helping the executive director with in-town events and doing more curatorial stuff. It was around that time when I realized I didn't actually want to be a curator. Turns out it was kind of boring. It was not my bag. I guess I was leaning a little bit more to the administrative side. And then I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, I guess. Our executive director left really suddenly, and I think it was 2005 actually, yeah, it was 2005. It was my first summer working there. But he had been really like free, I guess, with information. He'd be like, "Oh, if you're ever looking for this, we store it here, and if you're ever looking for this, this is where we keep it." So he was like, I guess he was a good trainer. I don't know. So when he left, I just kind of like took over the office, and I knew where everything was. And our board went through a period of like upheaval, I suppose, because he had left so suddenly. And so I was kind of like default in charge. In summer of 2005, I was 20, I guess. And then I was in that role for a couple of years. Essentially, they had hired another person to get some stuff in order, and they didn't really hang around very long. So by January 2007, actually, I became the head of the organization, I suppose, mostly because I already knew how it worked. So the board, I thought, was very brave in appointing someone who was literally like 21 years old to the head of their organization, but it was a really steep learning curve for a long, long time. But by now, I feel like I got a hold on it.
You're saying I'm doing administration, but the truth is that you are making the butter, you are planting the potatoes.
Well, this is true. Yeah, I do a lot of programming still. I have my hand, I guess, in the curatorial side as well. So we're a pretty small organization. There's 4 full-time staff year-round, which hasn't always been the case. We haven't always had that kind of funding. We can't afford to hire like curators with a lot of experience. So we get a lot of young people that are just interested in curatorial or have done a little bit of training, but not a ton of training. And I'm not a trained curator either. So we're all sort of flailing around a little, making the best decisions we can make based on, you know, professional standards and things. So I do have my hands in most everything. I do maintenance. That's just what happens when you work in a small museum, right?
The house is small, but the estate it's not that small, and you're just next to the Giscombe Trail.
I work for Huble Homestead Giscombe Portage Heritage Society. We're a not-for-profit charity, and we have a partnership with our local regional government to manage the Huble Homestead Historic Site, which is 40 kilometers north of Prince George, BC. So if you're familiar with British Columbia, Prince George is kind of in the middle of the province. We're considered northern BC, and Huble Homestead is north of the city, so it's a little bit remote in a sense. We're the only thing on the road. We're actually at the northern bend of the Fraser River. So if you have any picture in your mind of British Columbia, the Fraser River flows from the Rocky Mountains at the Alberta border, flows west towards the middle of the province, and then it turns south and flows all the way south through British Columbia and comes out at the Pacific Ocean. We're on the northernmost bend of the Fraser River. And the reason this is so important is because historically, of course, there were no roads. There weren't any roads. There were trails, of course, used by First Nations people. And the important thing about this particular place is that it's at the southern end of the shortest trail that leads between the Fraser River system, which flows to the Pacific, as I mentioned, and Summit Lake, which is the headwaters of the Peace River system, which flows to the Arctic. So essentially, this trail crosses the continental divide. Continental divide divides watersheds. There's an ancient trail, which is now called the Giscombe Portage, but the trail is ancient. In the local Lheidli dialect, it's called Cladesti, which means the shortcut, because it's the shortest route between these two water systems. When people were heading into the north of the province during colonialism, while Europeans were expanding, Canadians were moving, looking for resources like furs, gold, land, timber, minerals, things like this. They wanted to go into the north part of the province, but the route that they were taking was essentially coming up the Fraser River. You're heading west on the Nechako River. You're eventually getting to Fort St. James, which is on Stewart Lake. And then you'd have to get out of the water there and essentially portage to about 100 kilometers to get into the northern waters. So it was a massive trip, a lot of effort needed to get there. When this new route came known, it really changed the game. So in about 1862, John Giscombe, he was a Black miner from Jamaica. He had originally gone to California for prospecting in the California Gold Rush. Once the California Gold Rush was over, there were a lot of Black men that had come to participate in that gold rush. And once it was over, they're all still there. Californians didn't want all these single Black men around. They perceived them as a threat. And British Columbia's governor, James Douglas, invited them to British Columbia. He essentially said, there's gold here, come find it. So there was a big Black migration into British Columbia in the late 1850s, early 1860s. And John Giscombe and his partner Henry McDame, who was from the Bahamas. So eventually they have done a bit of prospecting in the south of British Columbia. In 1862, they arrive in Fort George because they want to take a tour of the Peace River region, which is north of us. But they arrive and the local First Nations, the Lheidli are like, you can't go now. It's winter. You got to stay. So they stay the winter. And in the spring, they continue their journey with a Lheidli guide. And they end up having to take a bit of a detour. There was an incident. This is always a weird thing to throw in without giving the details. But anyway, there was a party of overlanders that were heading to Barkerville for the gold rush. They're the last of the people coming overland from the east. They had a lot of problems. They essentially got stranded on the upper Fraser. And 5 of them, 2 of the party, made it to Fort George to look for help. And the others essentially died at the campsite. And they had asked these 2 brothers that had come, said to Giscombe, if you're heading north, can you please stop in and see? So he essentially is going a little bit out of his way because normally you'd leave from Fort George and head west. But Giscombe and McDame are going farther north at this point to check out this scene. Their guide had said, well, there's another route I can show you. But that route was flooded because it was quite early in the spring. And so he said, well, actually, I know one last way. Maybe it's the best. He essentially shows Giscombe and McDame Cladesti, the shortcut between the Fraser River and Summit Lake. And when they get back in the water in Summit Lake, they can now flow in the direction that the water is flowing north. They get to Fort McLeod. The people at Fort McLeod are like, oh, you are the first people that aren't Indigenous to ever come across this trail. There's like a 30 shot salute or something. Essentially, it's quite a big deal. And Giscombe and McDame continue on their tour of peace. When they return to Victoria, Giscombe writes an article that describes his trip, and he describes this trail. And that essentially is why the trail has his name now. So it was originally called Giscombe's Portage. Now it's just called the Giscombe Portage, people say. It's a provincially designated heritage trail. We're at the southern end of it because after that, the trail eventually became known as like the shortest route into the north. The provincial government was petitioned to build like a real sort of road over it to make it easier to travel. And years late, it kind of fell into disuse after like the Omineca Gold Rush was over in the 1870s. But by the time of 1905, it's still a viable transportation route, even though it's not super well used. And there's multiple people at the southern end doing essentially fur trade business. So they're trading with Sekani people who live north of the divide. They're trading with Clately people who live south of the divide, and they're essentially selling furs on to the Hudson's Bay Company. And one of those people was Albert Huble. So that's how we get to Huble Homestead. He was from Ontario. He had set up here at the southern end of the Giscombe Portage. Him and his business partner, Ed Seabach, eventually preempt land there. They start they have a store. They offer a lot of services, like they will freight your goods across the trail so that if you're traveling on the river and heading north, they'll use their wagons to take your stuff to Summit Lake so you can get back in the water. They guide people through the rapids that are just downstream. There was a really dangerous set of rapids that people would often find themselves getting into trouble at, and so you could pay them to guide your vessel through there. They're doing all sorts of stuff here, and they essentially have quite a little business going on. So one of the most important reasons there's a historic site there now is because Al Huble built a house there. It's a really beautiful house, 2 stories, squared logs. It looks just like an Ontario farmhouse, except it's in northern BC, and it's one of the only houses really that look like that. It was built in 1912, so it's the oldest house in our district. Even in the 1980s, I guess it was one of the oldest houses in the district. And so a historic site was created around it. So the regional district of Fraser Fort George, which is our regional government, owns it if they turned it into a regional park. And now since 2000, our society has operated that park, even though our volunteers have been involved in the restoration of the park, funding those restorations and providing services at the park since 1983. That's the Cliffs Notes version of Huble Homestead.
Prior to opening this museum, there was some discussion around moving the house closer to Prince George.
Al Huble eventually went back to Ontario to visit his family. He met a woman that he married. She came back with her youngest child from a previous marriage. And they eventually had 7 more kids together. By 1919, Hubbles are pretty much living in Prince George. They weren't living out there any longer. They would come back for summers. Part of the reason is there's a number of factors that contribute to the decline of traffic right there. So when that was the best route into the north, people were going through all the time. They were coming up the river, getting out, crossing the trail, heading on their way, and the same on the way south. In 1914, the railway is completed past there. And originally, people had thought that the railway was going to go in on the west side of the Fraser River, but it went in on the east side, which is not the same side that Huble Homestead is on. Suddenly, you have rail as an option for travel, and people prefer that to paddling upriver, obviously. And so people start taking the train. So there's less people coming to Giscombe Portage. Although for a while, people will take the train to a point farther upriver and then come down and then cross the trail. So they're still getting a little bit of traffic. But then you have World War I starts. A lot of men from that area go to war. Some of them don't return either because they're killed or because they just choose another place to go when they come back. And then the other issue is there's a road that's built from Prince George to Summit Lake. So why would you take the train or take the river when you could just take a road and then get in the water? Much easier. So business really declines. And as soon as the railway goes in, actually, as in 1914, you can see Huble and Seebach diversifying their business interests. So the Hubbles eventually move, they sell the property in around 1920. It goes through a few different owners. By the 1980s, it's actually like a halfway house for, I guess, convicts that they're rehabilitating. And then it's in a community pasture. And in 1983, the house is in terrible condition. It's like it's almost falling over. The foundations have like given out to the north and it's like looking really shifty. So there's a proposal from a local brewery that they want to move the Huble House into the city of Prince George to use it as a cold beer and wine store, which, to be totally honest, I'm like, that's not the worst thing that could happen to a historic building, like to repurpose it into something new. I think that's something that happens all over the world, and it's a good way to interact with our heritage rather than just letting it collapse. But a group of local people were like, no, the important thing about this house is where it is. It should stay where it is. So they eventually talk the provincial and regional government into creating a regional park around this house, and then they proceed with restoring it into a park. Huble Homestead is a unique example of Prince George actually supporting built heritage. And I think part of that is because when the Hubbles had moved to town, they had a lot of younger kids, and they come back in the summers and they would bring their friends. So there's so many people around the city who will say, "Oh yeah, my granddad used to go and spend summers at the farm with Al Jr." Or, "Oh, my grandma used to live there when she was a kid because it was a cattle ranch." And so you run into all kinds of people who have a personal connection to Huble Homestead, the place. And so I think that's one thing that really galvanized Prince George into supporting it at the beginning and continuing to support it now, because it's a rare example of the city actually preserving built heritage for once. And so we're very fortunate.
How do you select the staff?
Well, our staff are pretty much all people that worked at Huble Homestead as students. And so every year we hire 4 summer students to give guided tours to help us with our public programming events, to, do daily cleaning and things like that. Honestly, we're looking for people who are problem solvers, who are keen on teamwork, and who, they're looking for a job that's different, because this isn't really your average summer job. So we're just recruiting enthusiastic students, to be honest. We have a pretty thorough training program because the park, it encompasses so many different types of work. It's a lot of learning to understand what's going on, and so a lot of our students will come back for multiple years, which is really great. And to be totally honest, I wasn't a summer student on the historic site. I was mostly in the office. Probably took me a good 7 years to really truly understand all parts of the organization, because there's just so much. We run a general store, so there's like accounting and stocking and all the store stuff. We have food service, so there's all of those elements. We're responsible for maintenance at the park, so there's maintenance work to do and organize and fund. There's public programming, of course. We host about 8 to 10 public events a year. So there's advertising, the organizing of all those activities. We have school programming. So there's, writing that kind of curriculum targeted information, and the hosting of it. We take our activities to other local events. So we're in events in town. We do research throughout the winter when our site is closed. There's just a lot. There's a lot to learn about the park and how it operates. Never mind all the history at the same time. So we're just looking for people that are interested. And I think that's one of our strengths, is that our board, for instance, our board is not loaded with like lawyers and accountants and stuff. It's people who are interested in Huble Homestead. And so they come from a really wide variety of just sort of ordinary type jobs. But they care. They care. That's what we're looking for. And that's what we're looking for in summer staff too. And then having been the beneficiary of the benefit of the doubt when I was very young, I think it's important to promote young people to roles that they're capable of doing. And so we have, a relatively young team. Most of our permanent staff have been promoted into a permanent position as there was an opening and they were interested. The most valuable skill you can bring to a job at Huble Homestead is understanding Huble Homestead. So that's really, we love promoting from within. I like to give young people opportunity, and enthusiasm is like number one. Yeah, we do rentals. Weddings are a popular request. I got married there too. But yeah, we can offer people, we can only have small weddings, so like 100 max. You can have a wedding outside, but our buildings, we have two big barns. Usually the loft of the one barn is the most popular place. It has like, it's a hay loft, so like dappled sun sort of comes in through the sides, and it's just really beautiful. So people love having photos up there. And we do other rentals as well. So we'll do birthday parties. It's a little bit restricted because you have to have a birthday in the during our operating season. But birthday parties, we've hosted family reunions, we've hosted church services, we've hosted yoga. So yeah, it's a beautiful space. We welcome the community to it, and we try to keep the prices pretty reasonable. So the problem, of course, is that we're located 40 kilometers out of the city. So, you have to do stuff that draws people to you, because they're not going to really find it by accident.
So you recruit the staff from around the property?
No one really lives around Huble Homestead. There's a community like south of us at Salmon Valley. There's like a seasonal community at Summit Lake. But for instance, on our road, it's a 6 kilometer gravel road. We're at the end of it, and there's only cattle pasture between us and the highway. So we don't really have a lot of neighbors. So all of our recruiting is done essentially from the city of Prince George. We all live in the city, and we just commute every day, the half an hour drive in the summer. In the winter, like now, we have an in-town office. So I live only a kilometer or two from our office. And then when I have to go to the site, I go to the site. We carpool a lot. We all live here, and we just drive because there's nowhere to live out there anymore.
Season starts in May, June.
May, yeah. So if you've ever been to Northern BC, you can probably guess it snows a fair bit, historically anyway. Our site is closed for winter because it's just not accessible. It's difficult to access sometimes even in the summer. One of the reasons is that we're 40 kilometers north of Prince George. When you get to the end of the road, you park, but then you have to go down a hill, like 300-meter walk down a hill to get to the site. It's a beautiful little surprise when you get there because it just opens up and you can see the river, and it's beautiful. There's a lot of gravel paths, so if you have walking issues or a wheelchair, like you do need assistance in some of those cases. But we've tried to make ourselves as accessible as possible. The road into the parking lot is plowed in the winter, but we don't plow the road from the parking lot down because we just don't have the funding. And there's no heat or power down there anyway, so it's pretty cold. It's beautiful all seasons. If you want to get down there, we do go out in winter on occasion to shovel off roofs and things like that. So we're closed for the winter, and our season is essentially Victoria Day, long weekend in May, until Thanksgiving in October, and then we'll close and we reopen one last night for our Halloween event, usually in late October. But it's just too inhospitable to be there all winter. It was, back in the day, you'd have, 6 or 7 feet of snow, a lot of darkness. It's not for the faint of heart. And even still today, like it's a commitment to really to do that all the time. And most of us are so soft. We just want to be home in our centrally heated homes. But we're looking forward to opening in May. And then we're open every day for the summer. So it's kind of like we have a period of intense activity. And then luckily we have a nice rest time too. So our staff can take their time back from any overtime they were working. We can enjoy ourselves a bit. And then once January rolls around, we're like, okay, got to get back to work, focus. And then once February is here, we're like, oh my God, we got to open soon. So let's get organized. So we're in the planning stage. So for now, it's February. We're hiring for summer staff, double checking all of our procedures and our policies and things so that we're set up, because every winter it's a good opportunity for us to revisit all of our manuals and stuff, especially like if we've done any historical research and we want to change things and as part of the tour. So this is the time when we do that, when we review our educational programming and make adjustments for the next year. So it's kind of like a soft reset every year. If you didn't like how the procedure went last year, just restart it with new staff in the spring. And so it feels like we have infinite opportunities to sort of just try again if there's something that's not going well. But we're looking forward to our summer season, which is coming up.
I noticed that you are reenacting a lot of the daily activities.
Yeah, in a sense, we're not actors. So if you've ever been to, for instance, Barkerville, which is a National Historic Site, not very far from us, where we've been there many times, they have actors, right, that pretend like they're in the 1860s. We're dressed in an Edwardian costume, but we don't pretend to be anybody but ourselves. So we're we're just normal people wearing old-fashioned clothes. But we do, I mean, the goal is to bring history to life, right? So we do a lot of historic demonstrations, especially at event days. So you mentioned earlier that I'm out there making butter, and I have an interest, I guess, in making butter, so I do all the butter making now. So I make butter with visitors on event days, which they can take a taste of, and if there's any left, I might send it home with someone that's helped extra. We have a blacksmith shop that is fully functional, so we've had several blacksmiths over the years who can, make nails and horseshoes and stuff, essentially show people what it's like to see a blacksmith in action. And then our staff are trained in a fair number of different activities. So ice cream making is a really popular one. We've got the old-fashioned crank. Every year, our staff are essentially tasked with choosing a demonstration that they want to learn and then demonstrate for visitors, which is pretty open to their interests. So we've had people make lace, we've had people make vinegar, we've had people make soap. Like there's a lot of different options there because it depends on who you got that summer and what they're interested in. So we like to keep things as fresh as possible. And I think it's important because a lot of these skills were used a lot up until just a generation or two ago, and people have sort of left it behind or forgotten how to do it. So it's really nice to talk with people. So for instance, from their perspective of a butter making demonstration, a lot of people don't really understand where their food comes from, like how it's made. A lot of people don't really know. They know butter's made from milk, but how is just like, they're like, oh, it's made from milk. I'm like, well, yeah, but more specifically, it's made from cream. This is how it happens. This is what we're doing. You can see it's like whipped cream now. Everyone's like, oh, you're making whipped cream. I'm like, well, yeah, we're whipping cream. We just have to, if you've ever had your mixer on your whipped cream and you walked away and came back and it looks really gross, it's like you're on your way to butter. So, it's fun to have those conversations with people. And it's funny because a lot of them now are like, oh, yeah, I do make butter at home sometimes. Or it's fun to talk to people who don't know anything about what you're doing. And it's also fun to talk to people who do know what you're doing and have done it before. And none of us are pretending we're an expert on butter making or vinegar making, but here's the basic process. And I think it's important for people to understand how some of that stuff happens, because you kind of just assume that there's big companies making vinegar and you're like, well, yeah, but they're using like ancient techniques technically in a in a modern setting. And I don't know, I just think it's important for people to remain in touch with the earth and what the earth provides you. Yes, Homicide on the Homestead is a murder mystery. So I guess we've been doing it for about 10 years now. It's really fun. So I can't remember even how it started. You know, you can buy group mysteries for like up to 30 people who, you know, you get a character and you get objectives and you mingle around and you try to solve a murder. So we took one of those and we adapted it for the Huble Homestead. So we set it in 1915 and we had all of the people that signed up come in costume from 1915. And it was just like a real blast. And so we've done it every year. Sometimes we did 2 a year. We've been moving through the decades. This year is set in the 90s. One of our staff wanted to reset back to 1915, but I was like, I think people really want the 90s. They want to dress up like the 90s. So we take a mystery, we revamp it to suit our aesthetic and our specific local history in a lot of cases. And then, yeah, we just invite 28 people to buy a ticket and they come, they mingle in costume with all the other characters. They have hors d'oeuvres from the decade. Someone gets murdered in the middle, not usually a paying guest, but a volunteer that's sort of posing as a guest. And then they have to solve the murder in the second half. And then there's prizes and stuff. It's so much fun. One of the real, I guess, special things about it is that they get full access to the historic house. So normally all the rooms are sort of gated off. So you just go through the halls and stuff and you can look into the rooms. But in this case, we'll put away sensitive artifacts and open the gates and they have their hors d'oeuvres in the parlor and spill out onto the grounds and scheme and plot and buy each other off until we discover who the murderer is. It's really fun. We actually wrote our own from scratch once, quite a few years ago, that sort of settled. It was focused around what side of the river the railway was going to go on. So we incorporated a lot of local history into that one, but all of them are essentially, we create a premise that they're here in this place, why they're there. Like I don't know, like in the 90s, it's already a historic site. So we're like, hey, it's a wedding at a historic site. And someone dies in the middle. So it's a really fun time. It's one of our favorite events. It's a lot of work because we write these myths, we create all the characters and essentially have to find plausible objectives for all these people and motives and stuff. But it's so much fun. People really like it. We have a lot of repeat guests. Part of our problem, of course, I sort of alluded to, is we don't have power or running water out there. So you know, you gotta make do. So we're not gonna have a photo studio. So we can't plug all this stuff in.
So if you don't have water and power, how do you have a generator? Do you have a
Well,
well?
we have multiple small generators. So if we do need power, for instance, at a wedding, if you want some twinkle lights, we'll run a generator. Um, I guess about 10 years ago now, we actually did get solar power, but just in the general store. So we have like 12 buildings, but only 2 have power, for instance, and the Hubble House doesn't have any lights in it. So we have a bit of power. Solar is great and also has its obstacles, I guess. So solar, you know, we can run a till. We used to have a battery operated till, and we've been able to get a more of a real till. We have a fridge now that can run on propane or on electricity. So it's nice that we can switch back and forth depending on, you know, in the summer we can run it on electricity when it's sunny. In the fall, it'll probably be propane because it's just not as sunny anymore. And then we have outhouses for bathroom facilities, essentially, like just jugs you wash your hands out of. We have a little bit of running water in our general store. There's a well on the hill above the historic site, and they built a line that connects to the sink in the general store so we can run water. It's not hot water, so we have to still boil it any water for dishes and stuff. But yeah, we just make do with portable generators and our little bit of solar power and our gravity fed water line. It's a challenge in some ways, but it's good practice in others. Like when the power goes off in the city, you're like, yeah, well, I know how to do dishes if the water is not running. One of the things we're known for is our public events. And the reason we have them is because the displays, the exhibits are pretty much static. Like they're set up to be a homestead, and there's not a lot of wiggle room. Like you could move the brushes around, I suppose, on the dresser, but essentially the exhibits stay pretty much the same. So we need to do something to bring people out on a more regular basis. And one of those things is public events. So we host 8 to 10 events a year, usually on long weekends, so that there's not a lot else going on in the city on long weekends. So we kind of fill that niche, I suppose. And so that's one of the bigger draws for visitors for us. If we didn't have public events, we'd hardly have any hardly any visitors. Yeah, I would say probably 60% of our visitors come on a special event day. We try to offer a variety of different activities on those days, and they're all themed differently. So sometimes there's some focus more on the season, like spring on the homestead, or maybe Thanksgiving. We've got a kids carnival that is sort of obviously centered around kids. It's a really popular one in July. Our premier, I guess, event is Homestead Days. We have it on the August long weekend, and it's our sort of our most old-fashioned event. So we do tons of historic demonstrations. We have a box lunch social auction. So we've made lunches and we auction off homemade lunches to people, which is really fun. We've got a lot of games and races that visitors will participate in, and they'll get prizes. In the last 10 years, we've started things like the murder mystery. So that's a ticketed event for a smaller number of people, but it's still, is advertised and stuff. We created I guess, an escape room type activity in the historic house where you buy a ticket with your group and then you kind of solve like a series of puzzles to see if you can escape in the time. And then we have just some self-led activities as well so that people can come out and do things at their own pace. But yeah, essentially we want to be a safe, comfortable place for everybody in the community. And so you can participate or not, depending on your interest level while you're there. If you don't want to make butter, you don't have to make butter. You just go listen to the music or go play croquet or take a tour instead. Like there's a lot of options. And so we try to make things as easy as possible for visitors because I do feel like if you don't know what to expect, you're not as comfortable. And Huble Homestead can be a bit surprising at times just because people don't know what to expect, I guess. They get there and they have to take this walk down a hill and they might find a bear on the way. Like there's a lot of quirky things about Huble Homestead that you don't get in a lot of other places. So we want to make sure people know that they're welcome and that they can be comfortable there and that they know it's special, and hopefully they'll want to come back.
Have you received offers to film on site?
We've had a few filming things on site. Years ago, a local movie production, I guess, did film in the house as part of their movie, which was kind of neat. During the pandemic, especially, we had a lot of, I guess, like mini documentary makers, and I don't know, I would go and give them all this big tour, and I made butter with them, and like all these. It was at least 3 or 4 of them. And then I just like never saw them. I don't know where they aired, but in any case, yeah, like people come out and film little things like that. We had a commercial film once for like a local tourism office or whatever, but yeah, so there is a bit of filming, and it's a really photogenic place, so people love taking pictures of it. There's so many beautiful pictures of Huble Homestead online, and most of them are not even ours. Although we have thousands of pictures. Just you don't even know. So we're just as caught up in it as everybody else. Just like, oh, look at the house in this light, and we just like taking pictures. It's a beautiful place, and it's hard to beat for photography in all seasons. Spring is maybe the least beautiful time because it's kind of brown and there's no leaves yet, but every other season is absolutely great. You know, when it's in full summer, it's just like stunning, and then all the leaves change in September and it looks amazing, and in the winter all the snow. It's just a beautiful place, and it's so easy to take pictures there that we're really happy that people do.
What would you recommend to the visitors?
We have a lot of open green space, which is nice. There's buildings, there's grass, people can play games, do whatever. We have a river trail walk down along the Fraser. The biggest wildlife you encounter there would be bears on occasion, usually in the spring or in the fall. We have signs, that say if you see a bear, this is what you do. People from northern BC are generally aware of what to do theoretically when they find a bear, so we haven't had any issues, knock on wood. Um, but it's kind of exciting every now and then when you have people that have like never really seen a bear, because you'll get like Europeans or visitors from around the world, and they've never seen a bear, and you're like, we just stay here. We can watch it from here. Like usually they're just like eating grass. It's weird to see bears eating grass, but they do. And every now and then you'll see other things too, but not visitors don't usually see them. Like we'll see a coyote now and then, or we have a lot of bird life, which is pretty cool. I'm sure that I saw a barn owl, not a barn owl. I don't know, a kind of owl that I looked up after that is not supposed to live here. So I was like, if that's what that was, there was two of them. I don't know what they're doing here, but it was pretty special to see two owls in the daytime. We've been seeing more and more deer. Like usually you'll see evidence of moose have been through, but you don't see the moose, you don't see the deer. But we've been seeing deer. And yeah, we used to have a lynx that lived around there. I don't think it's there anymore because our ground squirrel population really exploded. But yeah, you see all sorts of stuff depending on not every day, of course, but it's special, I think, to be in a place that's a little more connected to wilderness than your normal city life. One of the things that I am most proud of is our children's book series. So we've written 4 children's books on the history of the Huble homestead and the Clayton Tenay. And so we've worked for the first 3. We worked with an artist whose studio was just next door to our office. And they're really beautiful little books. One's called Mr. Huble Builds a House. We published it for the 100th anniversary of the Huble House in 2012. And the second one was about Mrs. Huble and the garden, and the third one was about Mr. Seabach in the general store. The fourth one is called CP and the Fish Camp. It follows the Claytley girl and her family through the salmon run and then through the rest of the seasons as they essentially live in their traditional territory here. And so that was a partnership between a Claytley artist, a Claytley elder, and a different local artist who did the watercolors. And they're all just so beautiful, and I love them, and I love it when people say, oh, my kid's favorite book is Mrs. Huble Grows a Garden. It just makes me really feel really nice, I guess. The kids' books are one, mostly because they're a legacy for kids, I suppose. Like we wanted to get local history in the hands of kids, and I think we have succeeded to the best of our ability. Obviously, we self-published them all, so it was all on our own dime for the most part. I think that's one of the biggest things. One of the major projects that I'm working on now is a project based on the Huble diary. So Albert Huble, who the homestead is named for, kept a diary, a daily diary. We have, in 2020, his family donated them to us from 1909 to 1919. In the 1980s, one of our volunteers had transcribed them. So there's been a transcription of the diaries since the 80s. But when we received the actual physical diaries, we finally could look at his writing in person. Um, and so the local archives at the university, the Northern BC Archives, had recently acquired a book scanner, which was amazing because then we could personally scan all the diaries without having to send them away. So we have digital copies of all of these diaries. And as part of that, we started going through and comparing it to the transcription and realized there was quite a few errors in transcription just because of like the handwriting. I think it takes a while to get used to his handwriting. And once you do, you're like, oh, that actually says this, not that. But the other thing as we started doing that, the thing we noticed is how many different people he mentions. And so we started like documenting all the names he mentions on the date and little notes about them, which has grown into a multi-year project where we're essentially working on fully annotating the Huble diaries because they're such an unusual resource for this area. He mentions 400 unique names in 10 years. And so that was sort of our starting point. Like, who are all these people? A lot of them are travelers, they're local preemptors. Some of them are authors that actually write about their trip and they write about Huble and Seebach. Some of them are politicians. It's like a huge variety of people that are passing through here. And it gave a really a new perspective on Huble Homestead. Our tours focus on the family, as well as sort of what kind of things that Huble and Seebach were doing for their business. But it doesn't really, the diary gives you a much broader picture of like how busy the place was, because there's dozens of people passing through every day in the summer. Like especially while the railway is being built, all those supplies are passing by Huble Homestead. And those crews are camping there, having supper there, buying supplies there. Like there's a huge amount of activity. And so the diaries have really given us a different perspective on it. And so we've been working for 2 years now, I'd say, on essentially annotating the diaries, doing research on all these different people that he's named. So the goal is to turn it into like an online website so that a person could go there, they can see his original writings next to a transcription of them because his writing is sometimes difficult to decipher. And then a third column where you could essentially see an explanation of what is he doing here? What does this mean? Because a lot of it's very farming oriented, actually, which a lot of people aren't familiar with. Even, a lot of people don't have experience on farms, so they don't know what it means to do some things. But a lot of it's really like regionally specific. So it requires a bit of explanation for people that aren't from here or who don't understand like why they would be freighting things or this or that. And it's really giving a ton of information that we just never knew before or didn't fully put together. It's really put a new perspective on it for me. And so maybe that's one of the things that I'm the most proud of is like the work we've been doing with the diaries. I never really considered myself an expert on anything, but I think I am the expert on the Huble diaries. So I'm really excited about it. I'm looking forward to the next stage of the project, which essentially is finding funding and then getting it all online. And so I really hope that it's going to be a good resource, not just for researchers about Northern BC or genealogists who are looking for traces of their family, but for students as well, because it's going to give you unprecedented access to original historical documents about our area, which is pretty rare, I think. And so I'm really excited about that. The way that I describe Huble Homestead in a lot of cases is essentially like the start point of any kind of case study. So if you're interested in a particular kind of history, you can probably find a link to it at Huble Homestead. You've got the Huble family here, and then you can broaden it out to talk about economic history, transportation, family, children in history, women's history. You can talk about the gold rush. You can talk about Indigenous people. You can talk about, it's sort of like this little microcosm of of topics, I just, the more that I got into, for instance, the diary project, the more I started seeing Hubble as the center of a vast web, and it really puts it into context. Context, I think, is one of the most important things in learning about history, and I think that's what I was missing before I really got into the diary project was, obviously I knew about the context of Hubble Homestead, but truly placing it in its local and regional context is really vital because he's giving you connections to all the stuff that's in the newspaper, for instance. Like, oh, he talks about this. Yep, here's an article from the newspaper that is talking about exactly this. And he's sort of at the front lines of, I guess, Hubble Homestead is sort of at the front line of expansionism and resource development. Not that they're doing those things themselves, but they're a place where all the people that are doing those things are passing through. And I just think it's really, really fascinating. We have a fish camp. We don't fish there, but historically, the Claytley Tene, which is the First Nation from whose territory we're on, um, there was a family that had a fish camp just north of there. And so in 2005, our society partnered with the Claytley Tene Nation to build a fish camp exhibit, essentially, at Huble Homestead. So that's the main way we talk about Claytley Tene history, and actually have visual exhibits to go along with it. So it's set up like, I guess maybe I should give a bit of context. So the Claytley Tene relied on salmon as one of their main food sources, and they do all the fishing for salmon during the salmon run, which is in the late summer and the early fall. So while the Claytley Tene had a village in what is now Prince George, extended families had fish camps and hunting grounds and different places where they went for resources within their family. So within their territory, some families go here and other families go there. Just north of where Huble Homestead is now, historically, a Claytley extended family had their fish camp. And so they would fish for salmon during the salmon run. And so we've created, essentially, with the Claytley Tene, what would have been a temporary fish camp, but is now a permanent exhibit, so that people can learn about, how they were getting their major food source. And it incorporates, it allows us to talk about the history of the Claytley Tene and the effects of colonization on them and how they adapted to some of that stuff in their territory. And so it's a really valuable teaching tool, especially for students. A lot of teachers book that program for their school kids. And so they learn about the salmon and the Claytley Tene and how tied to the land the Claytley people were. And so the fish camp is a really lovely little spot. We don't fish. We don't fish from there. Nobody fishes from there, but it's intended to give you the idea of what it would have been like to fish for salmon on the Fraser.
How can people find you, reach you, if they need to book certain events in advance?
Well, most of our events, you don't have to book anything. You just show up during the hours. Sometimes we do require booking for things like the murder mystery or the escape room Sherlock challenge. And so the best place to find information about us is on our website, which is hublehomestead.ca. So that's Huble with one B. That's the other, Huble, homestead.ca. We have a really up-to-date website with all of our events listed on it. Anything that's like important or new, updates on if the Griscom Trail has been cleared, for instance, things like that. And so the website is the best place. You can find our email and our phone number on there as well. We're also on Facebook and Instagram. If you like pretty pictures of pretty places, that's, that's a good spot. And yeah, anything that if you contact us from the website, that email comes to me. So you'll get me.